The girl stood barefoot in the dirt, tied at the wrists with frayed rope. Her dress was 2 sizes too small and stained with dust, and her eyes, gray, unreadable, didn't flinch when the rancher approached. $11, the man said behind her. She can scrub floors and haul water, eats like a bird, doesn't talk much. Silas Rourke didn't answer right away. He stood silent, the dry wind catching the edge of his coat, his face unreadable beneath a battered hat. Behind him, his horse shifted impatiently. Silas looked at the girl. She was small, maybe 12, maybe younger. Skin like worn leather from the sun. Thin arms. A cut on her cheek that hadn't been cleaned. He looked back at the man. She got a name? The man shrugged. Answer to whatever you call her. I think she was born to a girl who worked the laundry in Amarillo. Nobody ever claimed her. Silas pulled out a worn leather pouch and dropped $11 into the man's palm. The girl didn't look up when the rope was cut. She didn't thank him. She didn't run. She just followed him to the horse like she'd done it before, with other men, in other towns, for other reasons. The ride back to the ranch was long and hot. She didn't speak once. Silas handed her a canteen. She drank slowly, as if afraid to finish it. He noticed the way her eyes scanned the horizon, not for beauty but for exits. But when they reached the gate, she finally spoke. Where are we? My place, Silas said. Call it whatever you want. What do you want from me? She asked, not defiantly, but like someone bracing for pain. He looked at her hard. Nothing, she squinted. So why'd you pay for me? He didn't answer, because he wasn't sure himself. The ranch was nothing special. A 2-room cabin, a leaning barn, and 70 acres of bone-dry pasture no one wanted. Silas had inherited it from a brother who drank himself to death and left nothing behind but unpaid taxes and a shotgun with 1 shell. He showed her where the well was, where she could sleep, on a cot in the pantry. Told her she could eat whatever was in the cabinet. Wasn't much. That night she slept with one eye open. So did he. The next morning, she was already outside hauling water when he stepped out. You got a name? He asked. She shrugged. Used to be called Annie. You want to keep it? She hesitated. It's mine, ain't it? He nodded. Then Annie it is. Neither of them knew it then. But that day was the start of something neither had asked for. Not kindness, not family, not love. Just the first spark in a slow-burning fire neither could see coming. Annie didn't ask questions. She woke with the sun, hauled water, fed the chickens, and mended what she could with old thread and instinct. She moved like a shadow, efficient, invisible, quiet. Not once did she complain. Silas watched her from the porch most days, pipe unlit in his hands. He didn't know what to do with her. Not really. He'd only bought her because the way she stood there, tied to that post like an unwanted animal, scratched something raw in him, and he hated the thought of her being sold to someone worse, which around here was most men. She never asked about payment, never asked if she was staying, but she made herself useful. She fixed a squeaky hinge on the barn door without being told. She patched the hole in the roof of the chicken coop. One day Silas came in from the north field and found dinner already made, just beans and salt pork, but hot and ready. He looked at her, standing in the kitchen barefoot with her hair tied back in a rag. You cook? Some, she said. He nodded. Not bad. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. On the 3rd Sunday, the preacher came riding through. He stopped for coffee and scripture, as he always had with Silas's brother. When he saw Annie, he frowned. Don't tell me you bought that child. Silas leaned against the post. Paid $11 to keep her from being sold to worse. You planning to raise her? Silas didn't answer. You planning to use her? Silas's jaw tightened. Don't talk like that around her. The preacher looked again, closely this time. Then he gave a slow nod. She's watching you, Silas. Closely. Don't waste it. Later that night, Silas found Annie sitting by the horse trough staring at the stars. You okay? He asked. She nodded. Preacher didn't scare you? She looked at him then, expression unreadable. I don't scare easy. Didn't figure you did. She hesitated. You going to send me away? No. Then why don't you ever tell me what you want? Silas crouched beside her, elbows on his knees. Because I don't know yet, he said honestly. But whatever this is, it ain't about owning you. She studied him, then nodded once. And that night, for the first time, she didn't sleep with her boots on. Summer pressed down heavy on the land, curling the edges of the prairie grass and drying the soil to dust. Silas worked harder than ever, knowing the cattle wouldn't last another lean season without new fencing and fresh water. Annie worked just as hard. She didn't ask for chores. She found them. Fixed the chicken pen when a fox got too close. Cleaned the stovepipe without being told. cut Silas's old shirt into rags, and turned them into bandages, just in case. It had been nearly a month since she arrived, and already the cabin didn't feel as quiet. One evening, after a long day of hauling fence posts, Silas walked into the house and froze. The table was covered in something new. A meal, not just food. Fresh cornbread, beans cooked with a bit of onion and smoked lard, a small jar of wild honey. Annie stood at the stove, barefoot, face flushed from heat, lips set in that determined line of hers. "I found some things in the cellar," she said without turning. Silas cleared his throat. "You didn't have to." She glanced at him. "I know." He sat down, watching her move around the room like it belonged to her. And maybe it did. Later that night, thunder rolled in. The wind snapped through the eaves, and a sharp knock of lightning lit up the prairie sky. Silas lit the lamp, then heard the door to the pantry creak open. Annie stood there in her nightshirt, eyes wide, not scared, just alert. "Storm's bad," she said. "Yeah. Want me to sit a while in case the roof goes?" He paused, then nodded. They sat at the kitchen table, listening to the wind moan against the walls. Silas poured her a half cup of coffee, heavy on milk and sugar. She sipped it slow, and for the first time he realized she wasn't just surviving here. She was becoming. "You ever gonna leave?" he asked quietly. She looked at him. "I used to think I'd run the first chance I got. And now? Now I think I might build something." She said it like a dare. He answered with silence. But it was the kind of silence that says yes. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm, one so natural it surprised them both. Each morning, Annie would be the first one up. She'd light the stove, feed the hens, and sometimes leave a biscuit and honey wrapped in cloth on the porch rail, where Silas would find it as he saddled up. She still didn't talk much, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't waiting for pain. It was comfortable, trusting, like the hush between chords of a song that neither had ever learned to sing until now. One afternoon, Silas returned from the north pasture with blood dripping from his arm. A nail had ripped straight through his shirt as he tried to brace a sagging post. Annie didn't panic. She simply brought the small tin of homemade salve she'd mixed from bear fat and wild yarrow and set to work patching him up. "You've done this before," he muttered through a wince. "My mama used to do it for the old men at the boarding house," she said. "I watched." He looked at her. "Where is she now?" "She left," Annie answered, voice even. "Or died. Depends who you ask." Silas didn't push further, just nodded. The silence afterward was long but not empty. Later, while he was resting, he noticed something unusual by the window. A sketch, just a charcoal outline on old paper. A cabin, rough and small, with a girl standing out front, hair blowing sideways in the wind. His cabin. Her! He touched the edge of the drawing like it was something fragile. When he looked toward the pantry, he realized Annie had created more than drawings since she'd come. She'd created space, and somehow she'd made it home. That night, as the prairie cooled and the crickets sang outside, Silas sat on the steps of the porch and said the words out loud, soft, like prayer. "She's not just passing through." He didn't know if anyone was listening, but deep down he hoped someone was. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving the days, he was living them. It wasn't long before the town started whispering. First it was the shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Dell, who eyed Annie from behind her spice jars. Then the blacksmith made a joke Silas didn't laugh at. Even the postmaster raised a brow when Silas bought sewing needles and a small spool of pink ribbon. "Raising her like a daughter?" he asked, not kindly. Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. But the looks didn't stop. One Saturday, Annie asked to come into town. She'd never asked before. Silas hesitated, but said yes. They rode in the wagon, her hands folded neatly on her lap, eyes wide as the buildings came into view. Main Street wasn't much, just 2 rows of sun-warped structures and a livery. But to Annie, it looked like a stage set for stories she'd never been invited into. She bought a bar of lavender soap with her own coins, earned from mending Silas's shirts and selling extra eggs. She didn't speak much, but her eyes took in everything. People stared, and she knew it. When they returned to the ranch, she was quiet, too quiet. That night, she didn't eat much, didn't hum while she washed dishes. Silas found her sitting by the barn with her knees pulled to her chest, face turned toward the dark horizon. "People talk," he said softly. "I know. You didn't do anything wrong. I know that too." He walked over slow. "I can talk to the preacher, make things clearer." She looked at him. "But what are we, Silas?" The question cut deeper than he expected. He sat beside her. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But it ain't what they think, and it never will be." She turned her head away, but he saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Pain, longing, hope. The next day she cut her hair. Not short, just enough to change the girl in the mirror into someone new. and for the first time, she asked if she could plant something beside the porch. Flowers, she said, and something that stays. Silas handed her a spade without a word, because he understood exactly what she meant. The flower bed bloomed slow. Annie worked it every morning before breakfast, kneeling in the dirt, sleeves rolled, humming something old and wordless as her fingers broke up the dry earth. Silas brought her wild seeds from the far hills. Some took, most didn't. But she kept planting, because something about putting roots in the ground felt like claiming space, like saying, I was here, and I'm staying. Silas noticed the changes. Annie had filled out a little, more from confidence than food. Her shoulders weren't so tight. Her voice carried more when she spoke. She still didn't smile much, but when she did, it lingered like sunlight after rain. One morning, she stepped onto the porch in a new dress, homemade, rough-stitched, and dyed with blackberry juice. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Silas stared longer than he meant to. You look, he began. Like a girl pretending to be a lady, she finished. He shook his head. No, like someone who knows who she is. That made her pause. And then just barely she smiled. But not everything bloomed with peace. That Sunday the sheriff came by, hat in hand, words heavy. Said he'd heard talk. People wonder what you're doing with a girl not your kin, the sheriff said, voice low. You know how it looks. Silas didn't flinch. She works, eats, learns. That's what she does here. The sheriff nodded slowly. Folks still talk. Then maybe they should talk about the ones who sold her, not the one who gave her boots and books. There was silence, and then the sheriff tipped his hat and rode off. But the tension stayed. That night, Silas found Annie in the barn loft, sitting beneath a sliver of moonlight. She didn't look surprised to see him. Do you regret it? She asked. Buying me? His jaw clenched. I regret that anyone ever had to. She nodded, pulling a thread from her dress. Then, I dreamed last night I was running again, but this time you were running too. He looked up at her. Were we running from something? She shook her head. Toward something. And for the first time, Silas let himself imagine what that something might be. Not escape, not rescue, but a future. The days warmed with the scent of sage and sun. Spring painted the hills with life, and Annie's flowers, stubborn and determined, began to bloom in defiance of every harsh winter that came before. But peace in the valley never lasted long. One morning as Silas was fixing a fence near the eastern ridge, a rider approached, dusty, lean, with a look that meant trouble. Silas narrowed his eyes as the man dismounted. Name's Merritt, the man said. I'm looking for a girl, around 12, quiet type. Silas straightened. There's no one like that here. Merritt grinned, slow and sharp. She goes by Annie. Used to clean floors in a gambling hall upstate. Ran off with some rancher. I've got papers say she's still under contract. Silas felt the blood rise behind his eyes. She's not property, he said. She's debt, Merritt replied. And someone paid good money for her upkeep. I'm here to collect. That night, Silas didn't tell Annie. He couldn't. Instead, he sat beside her on the porch, watching the wind stir her skirt and the blossoms sway behind her. You ever think about leaving? He asked quietly. She looked out over the hills. Every day, she said. Then I remember I already did. What's left now is deciding to stay. He didn't answer, just stared into the dusk, because the decision might soon be taken from them both. The next morning, Annie noticed he was different, quieter, tense. She found him cleaning his rifle by lantern light, and for the first time in months, she felt something that tasted like fear. You're not safe anymore, are you? She whispered. Silas didn't lie. No, but you'll protect me. He looked up, gaze steady. Until my last breath. She didn't cry, didn't run. She just took the oil rag from his hand and helped him finish polishing the barrel, side by side in silence, readying for whatever came next. Because Annie wasn't a girl anymore. She was something stronger, something rooted. The storm came 3 days later. Not of wind or thunder, but of hooves and dust. Merritt returned with 2 men, all armed, all wearing the kind of smirk that made Annie's stomach twist. They didn't bother knocking, just rode straight up to the porch like they owned it. Silas stood at the edge of the barn, rifle resting in his arms, jaw locked. This doesn't have to get ugly, Merritt called out. You hand her over and we'll be on our way. You don't, and we might just stay a while. Annie stood behind the door, heart thudding so hard she thought the wood might rattle. Silas didn't blink. She's not yours. She's not yours either. Merritt smiled. She's debt. Bought fair. Her papers say so. I'll pay it. Merritt laughed. It ain't about money. It's about control. That's when Annie stepped out. Not trembling, not weeping, just standing. I'm not going, she said, voice even. And if you try to take me, you'll see just how much this man taught me. One of the men behind Merritt scoffed. She got spunk. Maybe we should... He didn't finish the sentence. Silas lifted the rifle, cocked it, and aimed squarely. Leave. They didn't, not right away. But something in Silas's eyes, the steady, quiet promise of someone who had nothing left to lose, made them think twice. And when Annie stepped closer, standing firm beside the man who had given her safety and dignity, it became clear. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. They left, dust in their wake, hatred in their eyes. But they left. That night Silas didn't sleep. Neither did Annie. They sat on the porch under a navy sky, side by side, the silence between them thicker than any words. "I'll never let them take you," he said finally. "I know. I don't want to just protect you anymore, Annie." She turned to him. "I want to raise you right, teach you everything I know, not out of guilt, not out of pity, but because you're mine now, not owned, not bought, but chosen." And in the hush of midnight, for the first time in years, she let the tears fall, not because she was afraid, but because finally someone saw her not as something broken, but as someone worth keeping. The sun rose different the next morning, not because the sky changed, but because they had. Annie walked with a new stillness, as if something inside her had finally settled. Not comfort exactly, but a quiet understanding that she had a place. Not just shelter, not just food, but a future built with her name carved into it. Silas saw it too. He stopped calling her kid when no one was around. Started saying things like, "You decide," or "Let's plan it your way," as if she had a say now, as if her voice mattered. That spring, they planted more than just vegetables. They built a chicken coop, painted the front door blue. Silas even rode into town and returned with a piano, barely working and 2 keys missing. Annie laughed so hard when he rolled it into the front room she nearly cried. "I thought maybe you'd want to learn," he muttered, scratching his beard. She traced a finger over the worn keys. "I already do," she whispered. She played by ear, slow, clumsy, but tender, like someone unlocking a part of herself that had been waiting all along. But peace, like anything precious, felt borrowed. One afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, just her name in harsh, unfamiliar script. Annie didn't open it at first, left it sitting on the mantel like a weight. Days passed. Then one night, after supper, she held it in her lap while Silas carved a piece of wood by the fire. "You should read it," he said gently. She shook her head. "I already know what it says." Still, she opened it. Inside was a single line written in jagged ink. "You can run, but you'll never stop owing." Silas burned the letter without asking. But the look in Annie's eyes stayed. That old fear, the creeping doubt. And he knew, if they were going to have any kind of future, they couldn't keep running from the past. "We'll go to the law," he told her. "Real law. File paperwork. Make this right." Annie stared into the fire. "And if they say I still belong to someone else?" He met her eyes. "Then we'll fight, together." And in that moment she believed him. Not because he promised to save her, but because he believed she was worth saving. The next morning they packed up the wagon, not because they were running, but because they were claiming. Claiming her name, her rights, her future. Annie wore a patched dress and Silas's old coat, sleeves too long but warm around her shoulders. She sat beside him, hands clenched in her lap as the ranch disappeared behind them. Town was 2 days' ride. 2 nights of camping beneath starlit silence. 2 mornings of dry bread and tense glances. But she never once asked to turn back. Neither did he. The courthouse was smaller than she imagined. Just a square building with dusty windows and a single bell above the door. They stepped inside like strangers to their own lives. The clerk, an old man with spectacles and a voice like parchment, looked at Silas, then at Annie. "She's not yours," he said flatly. Silas's voice stayed calm. "She's not a thing to be owned, but she is under my care." "And her guardianship?" "Taken from a place that never filed it legal." Annie stepped forward, voice steadier than the judge expected. "I was sold for work, not adoption. No name, no birthday, just debt. I'm here to say I'm not a product. I'm a person." The old man blinked, surprised, and for a moment the room stood still. They filed papers that day, swore affidavits. Silas signed a declaration of guardianship, not of ownership, but of intent to raise and protect until adulthood. He'd rehearsed the words 100 times in his mind. Still, his hands shook when he wrote them. Annie watched. And when it was over, she reached across the desk, took the final copy, and held it against her chest. "Now I have a name," she whispered, "and someone to say it like it means something." They didn't celebrate with cake or music, but that night, back in a small boarding room, Silas gave her something else. A worn journal. "Blank pages. For whatever story you want to write next," he said. She stared at it. "No one's ever asked me to tell mine," she said quietly. "Then maybe it's time you told it," he replied. "On your terms." Annie opened to the first page. Wrote just 5 words. I am not for sale. Then she smiled. Because for the first time since she could remember, her life was finally her own. Life after the papers wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Back at the ranch, something subtle had shifted. The way Annie held herself, the way Silas looked at her, not with pity or worry, but with pride. Like watching a sapling he'd sheltered through its first storm, now reach toward the sky on its own. She started writing more in the journal. Not every day, but often enough that Silas noticed the ink stains on her fingers, the distant glint in her eyes when she was lost in thought. What do you write about? He asked once. Everything, she said. Things I remember. Things I hope for. Things I'm still trying to understand. One evening she left a page open on the table. Silas didn't mean to read it, but the words stared back like they were meant for him. I think he saved me, but I think I'm saving him too. He didn't speak of it, but that night, after the dishes were done and the animals fed, he sat by the fire and taught her how to mend leather. Just in case I'm not around one day, he said. She looked up. You're not going anywhere. He smiled faintly. Nobody stays forever, Annie, but we can leave something that does. Summer came fast and full. They expanded the garden, took in a dog that wouldn't stop barking but never left Annie's side. She named him Scout, after the first character in a book Silas had read to her. It was the kind of summer that's stitched into memory. Simple, warm, safe, but not everyone liked that she'd found peace. One morning a man rode up. Not Merritt, not one of the old crew, just a stranger in a fine vest and a slick mouth. Said he was from the city, that he'd heard about a girl taken in by a rancher under questionable terms. Said he was there to investigate. Annie stepped forward before Silas could speak. I chose to be here. The man smiled thinly. That's not always the same as being free, miss. Silas's hand gripped the fence rail so hard the wood creaked. But Annie didn't back down. Maybe not, but I am free. And I'll say it under oath if you'd like. The man blinked, then tipped his hat and rode away. When he was gone, Annie turned to Silas. Do you think they'll ever stop trying to take it away? Silas shook his head slowly. No, but we'll keep reminding them it was never theirs to begin with. The wind began to change as autumn crept in. Not just the weather, but the rhythm of life. The days grew shorter, the air crisper, and the hills blazed with color. Annie had never known a fall like this, where the leaves died beautifully instead of just disappearing. She pressed a red leaf between her journal pages and wrote, Even endings can be kind if you're not alone. But not all endings waited politely. One night a knock came at the door. Scout barked furiously. Silas grabbed the rifle from behind the wood stove, motioning Annie behind him. When he opened the door, it wasn't a stranger. It was Merritt. Older, weathered, with a scar down one cheek that hadn't been there before. He didn't look angry. He looked empty. Can I talk to her? Merritt asked, voice hoarse. Silas stepped forward. You can turn back around. But then Annie stepped past him, chin high, arms folded. I'll hear him, she said. They sat on the porch under the moonlight. Silas stayed inside but watched through the window, tense as a loaded spring. Merritt didn't speak right away. Finally he said, I didn't come to take you back. Annie raised an eyebrow. Then why? To say I was wrong. She blinked. I thought you were just another mouth to feed, he continued. A burden. But you were the only one who didn't ask for anything and still gave more than you had. He looked down at his calloused hands. You deserve better. I see that now. And if you ever want to come yell at me or hit me or spit in my face, I'll take it. Annie stared at him, then said quietly, I don't want to hit you. I don't want to yell. Pause. I want you to change. He nodded slowly. I'll try. And for the first time in her life, she believed he might. She didn't invite him inside, didn't offer forgiveness wrapped in tea and comfort, but she did stand up and say, You can leave now. He tipped his hat and walked away. And Annie? She didn't cry. She closed the door behind her and whispered, more to herself than anyone, I choose my life, I choose my story. Silas exhaled, the tension in his shoulders softening. You all right? She turned to him. I think I just ended a chapter. The first frost came early that year. Silas was up before dawn, chopping wood, checking fences, sealing cracks in the barn walls. He worked harder than usual. Half to stay warm, half to stay ahead of the winter that always came with ghosts. Annie noticed. You're trying to outrun the cold, she said. Silas wiped his brow. I've lived too many winters to trust the quiet ones. She didn't push. But that night, she made stew, his favorite, the kind that took hours to cook and made the whole house smell like home. And she said nothing when he lingered at the table long after the bowls were empty. Scout had grown older too, still loyal, still fierce, but slower now. Annie often let him sleep by the fire, his head resting on her foot while she read aloud from borrowed books. Silas listened more than he let on, quietly mending tools or polishing the saddle. Sometimes she caught him smiling, not at the story, but at her. As Christmas neared, Annie asked if they could hang something outside. Just a lantern in the window. "So the world knows this house still has light," Silas agreed. And when the lantern burned through the first snowfall, Annie said, "I hope someone out there sees it and believes there's still a place for them." Silas looked at her, just like I did. On Christmas morning, she gave him a gift, wrapped in cloth, tied with twine. Inside, her journal, the first one he ever gave her, now full. She had written on the last page, "You gave me a name, a voice, and a choice. I gave you a story worth staying for." He didn't say anything for a long time, but his hands trembled as he closed the cover. And when he looked up, his eyes were wet. "You gave me more than I ever gave you," he whispered. She reached across the table, took his hand. "Then I guess that makes us even." Outside, the snow fell in quiet flakes. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the slow, steady miracle of two broken hearts learning they weren't beyond repair. Winter stayed longer than expected. Storms rolled in one after another, turning the ranch into a white sea of silence. The horses huddled close in the barn. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin. For days, the world beyond their fence disappeared behind curtains of snow. But inside, time moved gently. Annie spent long hours reading, sewing, and learning to bake pies from memory instead of recipe. Silas taught her how to use a rifle, not for fear, but for survival. She was a quick learner, steady-handed and unafraid. "You're not a girl anymore," he said once. She met his eyes. "I don't think I ever really was." One evening, while the wind rattled the shutters and the fire popped softly in the hearth, Annie asked a question that had sat in the quiet corners of her heart. "Why did you buy me, Silas?" He looked up slowly, surprised by the softness in her tone. "I don't know," he said at first. "I didn't think I was saving anyone. I just didn't want to be alone." Annie nodded. "That's why I stayed." They sat in silence after that. But it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that held understanding, the kind that didn't need filling. In February, they got a letter. From Merritt, written in rough pencil, spelling clumsy but earnest. He'd found work on a ranch 2 counties east. He was sober, stable, trying to be better. At the bottom, a single line. "Tell Annie I'm proud of her, even if I never knew how to say it before." She folded the paper slowly and set it beside the lantern. Later that night, she added to her new journal. "Some people stay the same forever. Others change when someone believes they can." Spring was still weeks away, but one afternoon a sparrow appeared on the fence post. Annie watched it from the porch, bundled in Silas's old coat, smiling as the small bird fluttered its wings and took off into the sky. She whispered to herself, "I'm still becoming." And inside, Silas watched her with quiet awe, as if realizing that maybe he was too. The thaw came suddenly. One morning the snow melted faster than expected. Streams ran down the hills, soaking the earth, and the scent of damp pine filled the air. With it came the work of spring, mending fence posts, tilling soil, brushing the dust off saddles. Silas worked harder than ever, but it wasn't out of necessity. It was out of hope. He was building something this time, not just surviving. One evening, Annie found him standing by the barn, staring at the half-rotten wooden sign that used to say, "Wallace Ranch." The paint had faded, the edges cracked. She walked up beside him. "You thinking of taking it down?" she asked. Silas shook his head. "I'm thinking of repainting it." He paused. "But maybe not with my name alone." Annie turned, a soft breath catching in her chest. "Then what name?" He smiled, quiet but steady. "Whatever name we make together." That night, Annie sat awake with the lamp on, sketching in her journal. Words, ideas, names. Not because she needed to claim the land, but because, for the first time, she belonged somewhere. Weeks passed. Scout grew slower, sleeping more by the fireplace. Annie tucked blankets around him now, and Silas carved a little stool to help him climb onto the porch. "Funny," Annie whispered once, scratching his gray muzzle. "I think he's the one who saved me that day, not you." Silas chuckled. "Wouldn't surprise me. He's always had good judgment." Annie glanced at him sideways. "So do you." The town had changed since her last visit. Fewer stares now, more nods, more respect. She rode in beside Silas on a Sunday to pick up supplies and mail. When she stepped into the general store, the owner, Mrs. Griffin, handed her a small wrapped package. "No charge," she said. Annie blinked. "I didn't." "You earned it," Mrs. Griffin said simply. Inside the package, a hand-sewn apron with blue stitching and a tiny stitched phrase at the hemline. "A good home starts with a kind heart." Annie wore it the next day while making bread. Silas came in from the field, dust on his boots, sun in his hair, and paused when he saw her. He didn't speak, just smiled. And Annie felt something shift inside her. Something ready. By late spring, the ranch had changed. So had they. The fields were greener than Silas could remember. The creek behind the house ran full and fast. Birds returned, building nests under the porch roof. Life was coming back, not just to the land, but to the people who walked it. One morning, Annie came into the barn holding a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled just slightly. "I found this in the mail pile," she said. "It's from the agency, the one from before." Silas took it carefully. Inside was a formal letter. It spoke of oversight, policy changes, a closing of records. But one line stood out. "You are under no further obligation to provide guardianship. The girl in question is no longer under contract." "No longer under contract." The words echoed strangely. Silas looked up. "You're free." Annie's smile was faint. "I felt free for a while now." He folded the paper slowly. "Still, it's different seeing it." She nodded. "It is." A long silence passed. Then Annie looked at him and asked, "So what happens now?" That night, after supper, Silas stepped onto the porch. The air was warm, the stars bright. Annie followed. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, worn from years of use. A silver horseshoe pendant. Simple, but smooth from being held too often. "It was my mother's," he said. "She used to say it kept her safe when nothing else could." He held it out. "I want you to have it." Annie took it gently, eyes full. "I don't need protection anymore," she whispered. "I have roots now." Silas smiled. "But take it anyway, just in case the world forgets how strong you are." She looked at him, a softness blooming between them. And then, quietly, deliberately, she stepped closer and rested her head against his chest. For a moment, neither of them moved, but both of them knew, from her journal that night. Freedom wasn't the door opening. It was realizing I no longer needed to run. The rhythm of ranch life continued, but something had shifted beneath it. It wasn't dramatic, it was gentle, subtle. Annie and Silas still moved through their daily routines, mending, planting, feeding, but there were longer glances, softer smiles, and a kind of peace in their silences that hadn't existed before. One morning, Annie lingered at the gate, staring out over the field where Silas was training a new colt. Her journal was tucked under one arm. Her other hand held a mug of coffee she'd brewed just the way he liked it. Scout sat beside her, panting quietly in the sun. "You think he knows?" she asked the dog. Scout gave a half grumble of approval. She smiled. That evening, Silas found her near the creek, sketching. He sat beside her in the grass. For a while, they just listened. To the water, the birds, the wind in the trees. Then, without looking up, she said, "I didn't think love would look like this." Silas tilted his head. "Like what?" "Quiet, safe, steady." He nodded. "That's the only kind that lasts." She turned the page in her journal. On it, a drawing. The ranch sign repainted, this time with two names carved beside each other. A few weeks later, the letter arrived. This time from a woman named Rose. Annie stared at the name for a long time before opening it. Her hands trembled. Her breath hitched. It was from her mother. Alive! Ashamed. Wanting forgiveness. Silas stood nearby, watching her face as she read. When she finished, she folded the letter with careful hands, as if sealing more than just paper. "Do you want to write back?" he asked. Annie shook her head slowly. "No, not yet." Then after a pause, "But maybe someday." He reached for her hand. "Whatever you choose, you don't owe the past anything." She looked at him and whispered, "I know, because I have a future now." That night, her journal entry was short. Forgiveness doesn't always need a door. Sometimes, just not looking back is enough. By midsummer, the ranch thrived in ways it never had before. Vegetables grew fat and fast in the garden Annie had planted. The horses were stronger, the soil darker, and the old barn, once falling apart, had a fresh coat of paint and flowers planted beside its doors. But most of all, there was laughter now. And not just from Annie. It came from the children. Catherine, a neighbor whose husband had died years ago, came by one morning with 3 young siblings, orphans recently displaced from the next town over. "They need somewhere stable, just until winter," she said gently. Annie and Silas exchanged a glance. No words were needed. The children came with nothing but threadbare bags and wide, uncertain eyes. The youngest, Grace, hid behind her brother's coat for an hour. The middle one, Joseph, refused to speak. The oldest, Eliza, acted far older than her 12 years, always watching Annie with suspicion. Still, by that night, Annie had prepared warm stew, soft bread, and made up the bunkhouse with clean sheets. Silas sat quietly on the porch steps while the kids ate inside. "You ever think we'd become this?" he asked. Annie leaned against the post. "Not for a second," she said with a smile. The children took time to open up. But slowly, like spring thawing winter's grip, they did. Eliza began asking Annie how to knead dough. Joseph followed Silas around the yard, watching him fix things. Grace clung to Scout like he was the last piece of the world that made sense. And one night, After dinner, Annie caught herself staring out the window, not looking for danger or signs of the past, just listening to the sound of a family. Later in bed, she whispered into the dark, "I thought I was saved once." Silas stirred beside her. "But I think I was wrong." He turned toward her. "Why?" "Because back then I was only rescued. This is what saving feels like." In her journal that night, "I came here with nothing. No name, no voice, no power. But now they call me Miss Annie, and it sounds like home." Autumn rolled in like a hush. The golden light stretched longer over the fields. Trees turned copper and fire red. The days cooled, and the nights brought the scent of wood smoke and something deeper, settling. A stillness that only came when roots had found their place. Annie walked the perimeter of the ranch one crisp morning, a woven shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a notebook tucked under her arm. From the hill she could see it all: the barn, the house, the garden, the children playing near the stable, and Silas, splitting firewood with steady hands. This life wasn't something she'd stumbled into. It was something she had helped build, and it no longer felt borrowed. That evening, over dinner, Grace asked a question. "Are we going to stay here forever?" The table went silent. Eliza stiffened, and Joseph dropped his spoon. Silas looked at Annie. Her eyes were soft. Annie bent toward Grace and asked gently, "Do you want to stay?" The little girl nodded fast, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go nowhere else." Annie smiled. "Then you're already home." Later that week, Catherine returned. She came bearing papers, guardianship options, signatures, bureaucracy masked in envelopes. Silas hated paperwork, but he sat through every word. When Catherine was gone, and the door closed behind her, Silas spoke first. "Do you want to make it official?" Annie looked up from the documents. "You mean them?" she asked. He shook his head. "I mean us." It wasn't a grand proposal. No ring, no crowd, just two people, broken and rebuilt, sitting on a creaky bench on a porch that had seen storms, and held. She reached for his hand, heart thudding in her chest. "I already said yes," she whispered. He smiled. "I guess I just needed to hear it." Her journal entry that night. "Home isn't a place, it's a promise, and today I promise back." The wedding was simple. No fancy dresses, no crowd of guests, just Catherine, the preacher, and the children dressed in their Sunday best. Annie wore her hair braided with wildflowers, her dress borrowed from a neighbor. Silas wore his only good shirt, collar stiff and hands fidgeting as if holding reins. They exchanged vows under the cottonwood tree beside the barn, the same tree where Silas had once stood ready to end it all. But today it bore witness to a beginning. Afterward, the family shared stew and fresh cornbread in the kitchen, while Scout snored under the table and laughter echoed off the walls. Eliza stood to give a toast, awkward and unsure. "I thought grown-ups didn't keep promises," she said. Silas looked at Annie. Annie reached for his hand. Eliza cleared her throat. "But I think maybe this time I was wrong." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Silas and Annie stood by the window in silence. Snow had begun to fall outside, soft and quiet. "I think we're going to be all right," he said. Annie leaned into him. "We already are." Annie wrote one final journal entry, neatly, thoughtfully, in the same notebook that had held her pain, confusion, and hope. "I was bought for $11, but I was never for sale. What I gave Silas, what he gave me, was never owed. It was chosen. And in choosing each other, we both learned that love, real love, doesn't rescue. It roots. It heals. It builds."